All right, everyone. So we're on our last few slides of the hormonal lecture with regards to response to exercise. And we're actually going to start off with the adrenal glands and hormones. We know the adrenal glands sit on top of the kidney, and they're right there. And then we have the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla. Okay, and different hormones are either located or secreted from the cortex or the medulla. Okay. Right, so let's talk about cortisol for a second. Cortisol exerts its major catabolic effects. It is a major catabolic hormone, so meaning it breaks down everything for the most part, right? So we don't want to be breaking things down all the time. However, it exerts its major catabolic effects by stimulating the conversion of amino acids to carbohydrates, increasing the level of proteolytic enzymes, so enzymes that break down proteins, and then it also helps inhibit protein synthesis and suppresses many glucose-dependent processes such as glycogenesis and immune cell function. So this actually has a greater effect on type 2 fibers than type 1 fibers. So if you remember us talking, we talked about how the type 2 fibers, especially the type 2 B or X fibers, are actually more responsive to hypertrophy and strength. So when we relate resistance exercise training, the more cortisol that's being released, it could be a detrimental effect to those type 2 fibers. Okay. So cortisol is actually released in response to any sort of stressful situation, not just exercise or intense exercise. It actually can be released as an emotional stressor, a psychological stressor, and or an exercise type of stressor. Okay, so cortisol with regards to resistance exercise responses. It responds to resistance exercise protocols that create a dramatic stimulus to anaerobic metabolism, right? So we're going through anaerobic metabolism extremely quickly. Increases in cortisol might not have negative effects in men after a period of training to which the body is adapted. So there is actually your body can get better at handling cortisol. Okay, so it doesn't have as many detrimental effects, and that's a plus side of training. So adaptation, though, disinhibits cortisol at the levels of the testes, thereby maintaining testosterone's primary influence on its nuclear receptors. So it actually could, with training, testosterone actually will beat out cortisol for the most part. Okay. Resistance exercise protocols that use high volume, large muscle groups, and short rest periods in between sets result in increased serum cortisol levels. That makes sense. Your body's going through a stressful situation, which is high intense exercise, so more cortisol is being released. So through chronic high concentrations of cortisol may have adverse catabolic effects, acute increases still contribute to the remodeling of muscle tissue and maintenance of blood glucose. So even though it's kind of a bad guy, there's still a couple decent things that go along with it. Okay, so let's talk about the adrenal hormones again. So let's talk about catecholamines. There's two major catecholamines, which is norepinephrine and epinephrine. And if you remember from exercise physiology, or when you take exercise physiology, norepinephrine and epinephrine are also neurotransmitters from the sympathetic nervous system, but they are also considered sympathetic catecholamines and released from the adrenal gland as well. So let's see what their roles are as a hormone being circulating. So the circulating dominant catecholamine from the adrenal glands is epinephrine at 80% and norepinephrine at 20%. However, when we switch that and we're talking about the sympathetic nervous system and coming from the brain, it's actually going to be the opposite, where norepinephrine is the dominant neurotransmitter coming from the nervous system, and epinephrine is 20%, and the other one is 80%, and norepinephrine is 80%. So it switches based upon if it's a neurotransmitter dominant or if it's a catecholamine dominant. So let's see their roles. The roles is one is catecholamines help increase force production via central mechanisms and increased metabolic enzyme activity. 2, it helps increase muscle contraction rate. 3, it increases blood pressure. 4, it increases energy availability for use. 5, increases muscle blood flow, so via vasodilation, right? So the vessels vasodilate, allowing more blood flow to the area to bring more oxygen and nutrients, as well as clear waste. And then lastly, it augments secretion rates of other hormones, such as testosterone. So it helps other hormones release as well. Okay, so last slide, talking about the catecholamines and training adaptations. Heavy resistance training has been shown to increase the ability of an athlete to secrete greater amounts of epinephrine during maximal exercise. So because epinephrine is involved in metabolic control, force production, and the response mechanisms of other hormones, such as testosterone, growth hormone, and IGFs, stimulation of catecholamines is probably one of the first endocrine mechanisms to occur in response to resistance exercise. Okay, so I'll say that again. Because epinephrine is involved in metabolic control, force production, and the response mechanisms to other hormones such as testosterone, growth hormone, and IGF, stimulation of catecholamines is probably one of the first endocrine mechanisms to occur in response to resistance exercise. Okay, so knowing all that information we just went over with the hormonal responses to resistance exercise lecture, I'd like you to start thinking about how that configuration, number of sets, number of reps, total work volume, and the rest period in between sets, how those impact the different hormones we just talked about, and how that training volume or frequency, and including, so ultimately configuration, actually really impacts hormonal responses, and how those hormonal responses then impact the cell's ability to generate force, generate an increase in strength, power, as well as cell remodeling. So can it increase protein synthesis, increase the amount of actin myosin filaments? So what's your goal? So that all depends on per athlete or per exercise training regimen on what the goal is. And then what do we want to do to maximize our hormonal response to said exercise programs? So it's just something to think about, especially with different athletes. How do you want cell remodeling to occur with response to hormones, and hormonal responses to exercise is just another piece of the puzzle in strength and conditioning training. All right, everyone. Thank you.